The Vatican is the spiritual heart of Catholicism and one of the players on the international stage. And the influence of the smallest state in the world reaches to the furthest corners of the world.
On the first day of the full-scale invasion, the Pope went to the Russian embassy. I met some of these people in Rome. You could call them Russophiles. The Pope sending wishes to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church is hurtful, even insulting to Ukraine.
Attempts have been made to use the Catholic Church and the Pope himself as a prominent figure in the Western world to build up fake Russian pacifism. In this video, we take a look at what policy the Holy See is pursuing towards Eastern European countries, what role the Pope has played in the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and if the head of the Church can in any way influence global leaders. Vatican foreign policy does not rest on the will of the Pope alone. There's a whole team standing behind him.
As far as the implementation of international policy is concerned, this is formally the responsibility of each pope. In terms of the state system, the papacy is an absolute monarchy, and the Pope would set all the major trends, directions, and decisions. Of course, he also has assistants. This means ministers, a back-office advisory team, certain intellectual authorities, so it's definitely a team sport. And the Pope is the main player and gives the final seal on all the decisions that are made.
Formally, the implementation of papal foreign policy is handled by the Secretary of State and his entire team.
The executive of the Vatican's foreign policy during the pontificate of Pope Francis is Cardinal Pietro Parolin, a fairly close associate of the Pope, who is also mentioned in various speculations as one of the papabile, or potential future popes. He became Secretary of State in 2013, the same year that Pope Francis's pontificate began. There's the first section, the section for relations with states, which is currently headed by Archbishop Paul Gallagher. By convention, he's called the Foreign Minister for the Vatican, which of course is not quite true, but undoubtedly Archbishop Gallagher has this coordinating function, having oversight of the nuncios and documents. All these relationships are intertwined in the Secretariat of State, and it's therefore worth saying here that Cardinal Pietro Parolin also has experience in diplomatic work. Before he became Secretary of State, he had various other important functions in the diplomacy of the Holy See. History, and especially the last few pontificates, shows that Secretaries of State have had a significant influence on the Pope's policies, namely his diplomacy in the international arena. Under Pope Paul VI, the role of cardinal was extremely significant because he was the one executing the mission. He was the one who presented certain ideas and projects to Paul VI. This can be said about Cardinal Nicola Canali, who aided Pope John XXIII. But, for example, Pius XII had no Secretary of State at all and personally decided on all crucial issues. As far as John Paul II was concerned, while he used all available diplomatic instruments, he made the most important decisions himself. In the case of Pope Francis, it seems to me that there is more of a shift towards seeking diplomatic solutions, and hence the role of both Paolini and Gallagher is growing.
Pope Francis caused the most controversy when he spoke in surprising terms about Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine.
They are barking at the gates of Russia. They don't understand that the Russians are imperial and can't have any foreign power getting close to them. I think that the strongest one is the one who looks at the situation, thinks about the people, and has the courage of the white flag, and negotiates.
There were many similar statements. This began to raise doubts about whose side the Pope is on and why, unlike Western leaders, he does not want to condemn Russia.
Wypowiedzi papieża, które dotyczyły wojny z Ukrainą, były...
The Pope's statements that dealt with the war in Ukraine were well received in Russia, especially those statements that were controversial in the West. But it should be noted that these statements were usually taken out of context, and statements that fitted Russian propaganda were highlighted. This is why the statements about NATO barking at Russia's gates caused a stir in Russia, as well as statements which relativized the origins of the conflict in general or equated the role of aggressor and victim in the war. And there were several such statements. This was also emphasized by the Russians because it indicated, according to the main thesis of Russian propaganda, that not everything is so obvious and so clear, that the origin of this war is quite complicated, and it's not only Russia that is responsible for it.
Wielokrotnie jego wypowiedzi, ale również gesty.
On many occasions his statements, but also his gestures, caused astonishment and, more often than not, indignation in Ukrainian society, often also forcing a diplomatic response from Kyiv. These statements mainly concerned the role of Russia in this conflict, attempts to relativize the Russian Federation, sometimes justifying or disbelieving the war crimes committed by the Russian army. We can recall, in April 2022, during the Way of the Cross in Rome at the Colosseum, the Pope arranged for a Ukrainian and a Russian woman to carry the cross together, which was interpreted as an attempt to relativize the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, an attempt to equate Russian and Ukrainian victims of this conflict. This was met with outrage by the Ukrainian public. This line seems to me to continue the tradition of Vatican diplomacy in the area of armed conflicts. If we are dealing with armed conflicts in which two sides are involved, it tries, on the one hand, to avoid such unequivocal language, that it stands behind one of the sides. What's more, it tries to maintain diplomatic channels of contact with both sides. And here we see this rather ironclad logic that Vatican diplomacy has followed, even in previous pontificates. In his weekly audience, the Pope prays for a tormented Ukraine. Of course, it could be said that he does not add who the tormentor is, but the context is clear. Welcoming the victims of this war, mothers who have lost their children, the wives asking for help to bring their captive husbands home.
Oburzeniem również spotkało się.
Pope Francis's meeting with young Russian people in St. Petersburg was also met with outrage when he stated that the Russian people were a great nation. At the time, he mentioned that Russian youth should look to great figures such as Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. These are figures that have the worst possible associations in Ukraine. It was a very unfortunate statement, and this is because of the Pope's background, perhaps his historical education. It's also a question of the people around him who are implementing these talks with Russia. I met some of these people in Rome. In general, you can call them Russophiles. They are French and Italian. There is Russophilia in certain ecclesiastical elites, but not only there, also in the intellectual elites in France and Italy. Because I would point to these two countries where it is absolutely uncritical. It is a state of infatuation with the otherwise great Russian culture, the conviction that Russia is destined to play a role in the world, and that the West's aspiration is to get along with Moscow over the heads of others. So I wouldn't underestimate this environment. At the time of the breakup of Yugoslavia, for example, Pope John Paul II's envoys from the Vatican Secretariat of State met with both representatives of NATO, which was then conducting an operation against Yugoslavia, and with the administration of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia. John Paul II himself, commenting on the Kosovo conflict at the time, also used a similar, very broad formula, which may have not been to everyone's liking, but which said that the Kosovo conflict should be resolved in accordance with human rights and the principles of democracy and humanitarianism, but that, on the other hand, it should also take into account a certain historical truth, or simply put, certain Serbian rights or claims to Kosovo based on historical nature. The same was true at the time of the US invasion or operation in Iraq in 2003. The then outgoing Pope John Paul II, who was already very sick and in the last 2 years of his pontificate, was strongly opposed to a military solution to the dispute and was against the military invasion of Iraq. On the other hand, while opposing the invasion, he also maintained contacts with the administration and representatives of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, which was overthrown as a result of the American invasion. And it's here where we see this rather ironclad consistency, that it is always an attempt at mitigating, not using explicit radical language which is attributed to and belongs more to the arsenal of either active politicians or publicists.
The Vatican was engaging in talks with Russia even before the full-scale invasion began.
The beginning of the relations of Pope Francis's pontificate with Russia in general, in relations on Eastern issues, was the meeting with Patriarch Kirill in Havana in 2016. The meeting of the two hierarchs was also the first meeting in several hundred years between a Roman pontiff and the Orthodox Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. The two hierarchs then adopted a long declaration called the Havana Declaration, almost 30 points long, which is also quite unique, because usually declarations of a political nature are short in wording. This one was rather long and referred to, let's call them, fundamental civilizational problems.
Zwłaszcza takim negatywnym echem.
The Pope received criticism for sending name-day wishes to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, in which he complimented his role in efforts to promote human rights. For Ukrainians, statements like this about the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, who supports the Russian aggression and blesses the weapons of the Russian army, are hurtful, even offensive, and it is hardly surprising that Ukrainians reacted with indignation towards these gestures from Pope Francis.
Rosyjska cerkiew prawosławna jest bardzo mocno zaangażowana.
The Russian Orthodox Church is very involved in justifying Russian aggression against Ukraine and is also making mobilization efforts towards Russian society to encourage Russians to participate in the war. Among other things, it's necessary to mention aggressive statements by the Patriarch and encouraging Russians to take part in the war, such as statements made in one of his sermons, saying that Russians, soldiers who take part in the war and perish, will have all their sins forgiven and will be saved, because it's a great honor and glory to serve the homeland and perform this good mission. So this is directly linked to mobilization in Russia, and the fact that it is the Patriarch who is encouraging Russians to participate in the war. The Russian media's coverage also often features clerics, such as military chaplains, who are present on the front line, who sometimes use very harsh words to criticize Ukraine and engage precisely in the ideological justification of this war. There are also sometimes scandalous statements when it comes to the participation of Russian society in the war. For example, a statement that resonated in liberal circles in Russia was made by one of the clergymen, who on TV said that if a mother loses her son in the war, well, it happens. She should simply give birth to more children, and then she won't feel bad anymore. In January 2022, a conflict in Europe was palpable. The last chance talks in Geneva, during which Russia demanded the withdrawal of NATO infrastructure from countries that joined the alliance after 1997, had failed.
Almost parallel to these failed last chance talks in Geneva, Archbishop Paul Gallagher, vice head of the Secretariat of State, went to Moscow with a last chance mission. He also met with the authorities in the Kremlin, and at a time which was indicative of a certain, perhaps one might say, drama of the situation. He issued a pessimistic-sounding communique after this meeting that the Vatican was pained to learn that the peace talks between the West and Russia had so far failed, and which, reading between the lines, already foreshadowed an outright war. On the first day of the full-scale invasion, the Pope went to the Russian embassy in Rome, where he spoke to diplomatic representatives, later explaining that he wanted to learn from the proper source about the reasons for the full-scale war. And this is very much in the Franciscan spirit. He spontaneously, alone, went to the Russian embassy. One can make fun of it, say that it shows weakness, ignorance of Russia. But for me it was quite a touching moment of authentic pastoral action, because Francis must be seen in this context, as someone who goes to admonish and say, I plead with you, stop doing this evil. Later, he also spoke online with Patriarch Kirill. This conversation also turned out to be a bit inconclusive because, as the Pope summed it up, he often did not understand what Kirill was talking about, and he was a bit surprised by his approach, the very strong connection of the Russian Orthodox Church with politics. Well, this wasn't news, so to speak, for observers who described the relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state authorities.
Próbowano wykorzystywać Kościół katolicki i
There have been attempts to use the Catholic Church and the Pope himself as a significant figure in the Western world to push their propaganda thesis and to also influence opinion leaders, politicians, and so on, and to use this to build up fake pacifism. During the Soviet era and in the history of modern Russia, Russia used religious channels and used, above all, the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarch to conduct its foreign policy. In this Russian system of power, the role of the Church is very clearly defined as an instrument of influence, I would say. During the war, we clearly see that the Church is not an independent religious player, but performs tasks at the behest of the state. This is also the role it plays in this war. So we see unequivocally that the instrumental treatment of the Church is aimed at building relations on religious grounds, but in fact it is also intertwined with politics and political interests. Following the full-scale Russian invasion, Ukraine took legal action and banned religious gatherings subordinate to Russian institutions.
Krytyka papieża Franciszka odnośnie
Pope Francis's criticism of the alleged restrictions of religious freedom in Ukraine also caused surprise in Ukraine.
Tutaj Watykan rzeczywiście...
Here the Vatican actually avoids taking a clear position to support this new Ukrainian autocephaly, which, by the way, was granted by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople and Patriarch Bartholomew, with whom the Vatican has excellent contacts. The Patriarch of Constantinople visits Rome almost every year, and Vatican representatives also visit Constantinople practically every year. Here the Vatican is probably directly suggesting that the question of this new Ukrainian autocephaly is an internal matter for the Orthodox Church, especially the Russian and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and it should somehow be settled between them. So here the Vatican perhaps does not want to give Russian Patriarch Kirill the excuse that it directly supports this new autocephaly.
W tym momencie ze strony rosyjskiej widzimy, że właśnie w
What we see from the Russian side at the moment is that there is a great deal of narratives in Russian propaganda to show that the Ukrainian authorities are taking action to eradicate orthodoxy, not just Russian orthodoxy, but any orthodoxy overall. That's one of these narratives. The second narrative line is that the war in Ukraine is a religious war. It's a holy war in the sense that Ukraine, as a state supported by the West, and the West, in the rhetoric of the Russian Orthodox Church, is satanic, has renounced Christianity, has renounced God. Russia, on the other hand, is standing up for faith, not only Orthodoxy, but Christianity in general. It is standing up to the West, and that is why this clash is now taking place in Ukraine. The most visible actions of the Russian Church, which implemented Russia's aggressive policy towards Ukraine, were seen with the annexation of Crimea. Post factum, we know that certain actions related to the annexation of Crimea were prepared under the excuse of organizing a religious pilgrimage there. Activists, KGB officers, services, and oligarchs, for example, Orthodox people close to the Kremlin, who were involved in the preparation of this annexation, were also involved in the pilgrimage. And here there's a great deal of material prepared by the Russian independent media and Ukraine that proves this. Names such as Konstantin Malofeyev and Strelkov Girkin appeared there. In their statements, they spoke directly and revealed the background of how the annexation was prepared, like establishing contacts with various local organizations, including religious ones, to prepare the smooth takeover of Crimea. Among the leaders with whom Pope Francis had the closest contacts was Viktor Orban.
W narracji węgierskiego rządu Viktor
In the narrative of the Hungarian government, Viktor Orban and Pope Francis are essentially the only figures in Europe who genuinely care about peace in Ukraine and have the same understanding of the conflict taking place there. The Vatican was the first place the Hungarian Prime Minister went to after his re-election in 2022, not least because he sought support there for his policy towards Ukraine and his rather unusual, in the European area, attitude towards Russia and not condemning its actions as an aggressor. The Pope was also a very important figure when it came to the so-called peace mission that Viktor Orban undertook last year. It involved visiting a number of non-obvious places, such as Moscow, Kiev, and China, and broadly representing his approach to the war. Viktor Orban also visited the Vatican in 2024 under this banner of a peace mission, which coincided with Hungary's presidency of the Council of the European Union. However, this story of the Pope's relations with Viktor Orban has yet another underlying narrative. Jorge Mario Bergoglio has been very supportive of refugees in Budapest since the beginning of his pontificate. The Pope was portrayed as a supporter of illegal migration, of multiculturalism. It was feared that his pontificate was a threat to European identity. This was one of the reasons why he was criticized by Cardinal Péter Erdo, the head of the Catholic Church in Hungary, who is now being considered as one of the likely successors to Pope Francis himself.
W czerwcu 23 roku
In June 2023, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi took on the role of mediator between the Russian and Ukrainian sides. He visited Kyiv, where he met with Volodymyr Zelensky. Later, he traveled to Moscow. In 2024, he continued his mission, meeting, among others, with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, also with the Kremlin's foreign policy advisor Yuri Ushakov. This Vatican initiative has not led to any spectacular results. In fact, it was reduced to a certain mediating role regarding the exchange of prisoners between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
Rosjanie rozgrywali to na własną korzyść.
The Russians played this to their advantage, showing that here they were willing to help. The papal envoy, Matteo Zuppi, for example, met with Presidential Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, who, by the way, is accused in the International Criminal Court of having supported the deportation of children from Ukraine. This also appeared on Russian television. That here, the Russians have an open attitude and are willing to talk and are happy to accept the Pope's declaration when it comes to the peaceful resolution of conflicts. This fitted in with the main line of Russian propaganda, which is that Russia is peace-oriented, that it would very much like to make peace, and it is Ukraine that is the aggressive state. And this narrative as well, sustained directly by the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, saying that Russia, after all, has never attacked anyone, is also willing to make peace. We can see that the Russians were playing the Vatican's actions to their own advantage. And here, this pacifist narrative on the part of the Vatican is also very welcome. During the 3 years of the conflict, Pope Francis has donated ambulances, cars, mobile clinics, and medical equipment to Ukraine.
Ja już nie mówię o tych 260 tirach.
I'm not even talking about the 260 trucks that were sent with humanitarian aid, which was personally taken by his closest collaborator in this regard, Cardinal Krajewski. I had the pleasure of meeting him in Lviv. Krajewski travels very far indeed, and was also very close to the front line. But it is not something quite out of the ordinary. If all the media say, oh, the Pope's closest collaborator, he went to give our soldiers something, does this indicate neutrality? No. These are concrete expressions of papal sympathy and support.
Even though the cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel during the conclave elect a new pope under the influence of providence, what truly decides is politics.
Who becomes the new pope is primarily determined by the balance of power in the College of Cardinals.
W przypadku na przykład wyboru
In the case of the election of Cardinal Wojtyła, for example, this was important. He was a very well-known figure to the Roman Curia, which knew of his influence on Paul VI. Everyone knew what views he had on life, on these civilizational disputes, which were important. They were also looking for someone fresh, not an Italian, a man as if from the other side of the curtain. There is that famous speech by John Paul II where he says that he comes from a distant country. The choice of Benedict was obvious. I think that here what moved the needle was that amazing homily he gave during the Way of the Cross, talking about the sinking boat of the Church, full of filth, iniquity, which needs to be saved. He struck a tone very close to that of many cardinals who still saw those last years of John Paul II, who was seriously ill, as a kind of regression, not always a fully adequate response to what was going wrong inside the Church itself. And then finally comes Francis, who, it's worth remembering, had also already received votes at the time of Benedict's election, and not a small number overall. Clearly he was very charismatic. That's also something we need to remember. the character of someone from another world. I think Europe was already tired of itself, so a different outlook was needed. I am one of those who think very highly of this pontificate, and I believe that it irreversibly changed the Church, in many cases for the better.
Widzimy, że w czasach tego pontyfikatu Franciszka trwającego...
We can see that during his 12-year pontificate, Pope Francis has ensured his strong representation, as there are currently 138 members of the Cardinal College eligible to elect the Pope. Only a few of the cardinals, the most senior ones sitting in this college, were appointed by John Paul II. Benedict XVI appointed a dozen or so 101 cardinals appointed by Francis suggests that the area of this election will be clearly directed at those who support Francis's line. One can also infer that, since we have cardinal creations, here too the Pope sort of sovereignly decides on the creation of cardinals. He usually creates those people close to his theological, social, and probably also political line.
Będzie całe grono kardynałów, które będzie...
There will be a whole group of cardinals raised in the Franciscan spirit, and I think there will be a search for someone who can continue in this spirit. Maybe it will be an Italian ministering in some hotspot of the world, for example in Jerusalem. It will certainly not be a mere representative of the Roman Curia. That is my impression. If it's an Italian, it will be someone with experience of working in some remote area. And Jerusalem seems to me to be relatively important and close. And the hierarch from there is an outstanding personality, but time will tell.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, take a look at our other stories on screen now.